Hey everybody, it's Peter again, and back in the saddle for round 2 of the XLS veneering video. The first one I did was so long, I think I would have put people to sleep. And what I'm going to do is trim that up a little bit, and I'll post it on Google Drive, and I'll put a link down below. So if you want to watch the big long video, you can. This version is going to be kind of the quick cliff notes, hit the high spots, and if there's questions I can answer them, or you can watch the other video. So to get started, everything that I'm going to use is here, and as I progress through these segments you'll see where I use it. So this is an 80 grit sanding pad. That's actually a sanding belt put on a piece of plywood. You've seen me use it before. This is a sanding sponge, and I'll use those to fair these radiuses here. Router bits, you don't need 3 routers, 1 will do. And I have a lot of routers. It's possible I have too many routers, but so I chuck up bits in different routers rather than changing them. So what I've got here is 2 flush trimming bits. One you've seen before, that's a spiral flush trimmer, 1/4 inch, and we'll use that to trim the veneer, except for one spot where we'll use this one, which I think I showed in another video. That is a really small bearing surface flush trimmer that you can get right down in the bearing, or the rabbet for the tweeter. You can put that right down in there, and I'll show you how that all works. That's a 1/2 inch round over bit for that I did the radiuses on the cabinets with. And this veneer is going to be put on with what they call heat lock glue, which is an iron-on method. This glue is specifically made for this kind of glue up, and it works really well. And you can get it from a company called Veneer Supplies. Again, I'll link to them and show photos at the end of the video. And another thing you get from them is a veneer glue roller. And this is actually works better. For a long time I used regular rollers. This works better. This doesn't absorb a lot of glue, and it just serves to kind of move things around in a way that makes it real easy to apply an even coating, which is what you want. 1/8 inch drill bit, gonna need that, I'll show you where later. Chalk is handy for marking veneer, which I'll talk about right now, I guess. This is a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet of paperback veneer, and this happens to be white oak, and the other video shows red oak. They're really close in a lot of ways, but a little bit different tree. And this paperback veneer is really flexible. It acts more like paper than it does like raw veneer, so it makes it really easy to do stuff like this. The only drawback being, if you look really close, you can see the veneer edge. Most people probably wouldn't even notice it. An iron. I got this iron at the Goodwill store down the street. Cost me $6. It's an old timer. It's kind of heavy, but in this case it works out pretty good. So you don't have to spend a lot. It's just a regular old clothes iron. You don't use the steam function. And this is a little pick that I'll use to locate these holes once I put the veneer over them, and I'll show you when I get to that portion. You want a bucket to throw the roller in between gluing sessions. That keeps the glue from drying up on it, and I use it to kind of rinse that out in between. A little easier than washing the roller each time. What you don't want to do is let glue dry on this, because it will, if it doesn't end its life, it'll shorten it pretty significantly and sort of make it useless for spreading glue. So you need one of those. I talked about chalk. That's how I mark on that. A little better than pencil. Pencil, because of the leads, are graphite, and it can stain wood and wood veneer, so I tend not to use it in places like that, and chalk's really easy to come by. It's just regular old chalkboard chalk. And a file. This is what's called a handy file, which means it's got a double cut on one side and a single cut on the other, and I'll show you where I use that. This is called a file card. Don't ask me why it's called a file card. It's basically a stiff wire brush, and you use it to clean the file. And if you haven't used one of those before, they're actually really nice, especially when you're filling the file teeth full of glue they tend to get less effective. So you clean it with this and it cleans it right up. So that's it for materials. You'll see where I use these in the steps, and I'm gonna just do one cabinet. I'm gonna fast forward through a lot of it and assume that some of the stuff you can kind of get an idea how to do and be on your own rather than go through every step like I did in the other video. So we'll stop this. I'm gonna get these pieces cut for these cabinets, and then we'll come back and show glue application, and after that, how to actually put the veneer on, route it to size, and get right down to the point of final finishing, which would involve sanding and prepping for however you're going to finish them. So I'll be back soon. You'll see a little bit different bunch of stuff here. Alrighty, so I've cut all the veneer into strips, and I cut, well, you can kind of see the grain. The direction of grain typically on veneer, like the roll I showed earlier, runs from in the 8-foot direction. So the grain follows the 8-foot dimension. You can get it the other way, but so I cut it in strips, and the strips you see here will be the pieces I glue up. So I've got 2 backs. That'll cover this, and that'll be the first thing we do. And then these 2 pieces will be wraps that run over the side, over the front, and down the other side. And the backs and the fronts, or I should say the wraps, were all cut from the same width. So I just cut this strip 2 inches wider approximately than this dimension right here. So that means that you've got some overhang and some you're going to trim off. You don't need to be really precise with this part of the process. It can be pretty loose and still be just fine. Then the other thing I cut out of 2 different strips were 4 tops and bottoms, which will go on there like that. So that covers all the cutting. I've got all that cut out. Next, I'm going to glue these up, glue the cabinets, and so we'll get back to you right after I get that set up. All right, I've got the backs taped down on just a piece of particle board here. You can do this on cardboard. Probably want to do it on something that's not that you don't care about too much, because you're going to roll over the edge of that and get it on this scrap. And I've done it on cardboard, so you can do that too. And then I've got all these flush trimmed, of course, and I actually ran a orbital sander over it with a hard pad to kind of flatten things out, make sure there's no imperfections in it. And I feel things a lot with my hands to make sure they're like I want them. And now we're going to apply glue. And what I'm going to do is just kind of talk a little bit as I go on the first one and maybe the back too, and then I'll just shut up and I'll kind of speed through the application on the second cabinet. I get this glue in gallons because it's a little cheaper that way, and I'll use it up. But for someone who's just doing this one time, you may want to just, I think they have it in pints as well, so you can. So what I'm doing here, I'm just using that roller I showed you earlier, and the application is kind of like painting. What you're doing is just taking that glue I squirted out on there and getting it spread evenly over the whole surface. And that's the key right there. And you can tell because of the color of the glue whether it's even or not just by how it looks on the surface. And you may not be able to see it in the camera, but when you start putting this on, you'll see when it's even. You can see if there's thin spots or spots that are thicker. Although this roller does a really good job of preventing thick spots. It just has a really nice way of distributing the glue, and that's why I recommend it. Like I said, I've tried other methods, and this really does work the best. And again, that comes from Veneer Supplies. Here you want to be a little bit careful that you're not getting big drips of glue down into the tube connector holes, or if you've got a binding post back, then you just don't want to have it dripping over the edges. So sneak up on it a little bit, kind of roll it out, and the the roller will do the work of kind of getting it to the point of being even throughout. So you can see what I'm doing. It's not particularly difficult, but you do want to make sure that the coating is even. Probably better to apply a little less glue, or a little too little glue, and then you can add to it as opposed to putting too much on and having it in places you don't want it. So I'm going to shut up and do the other two pieces. I'm only going to veneer one cabinet just for the sake of keeping the video a little shorter. Okay, so I've got everything coated, and don't forget to throw your roller in the bucket, and I let it sit for a little while and I swish it around to kind of clean out the glue, and that way when you go on to the next step you can just pull the roller out, and I usually wrap a paper towel around and just kind of squeeze the excess water out and then go from there. And I don't know how easy that is to see, but I'm going to hold that up so you can kind of see how evenly coated that looks, so that you just want the color of that glue to be consistent over the whole surface. And in order to speed this up, I'm actually going to put a fan on it. You don't have to, you can let it air dry anyway. And so the next segment will show application of one of these backs and routing it off, and then we'll do the wrap around the sides and the front, and then the top and the bottom. So be back in a little bit. I'm back, and glue is dry. I don't know if you can remember what that looks like, but this it starts out kind of pink, and when it's dry it gets a lot browner, and what you're looking for is evenness of that brown color. So what we're going to do is apply this back, and then I'm going to set this aside. I'm actually going to do the other one, probably not film that in order to keep this short, and then come back and trim that, and then we'll do the wrap that goes around the sides and the front. So the way I do this is set your iron on, I think they say cotton setting, which is pretty hot. That's up near the top end of the scale on all the irons I've seen. And if I'm not mistaken, I got to be honest, it's been a while since I've read the instructions on the heat lock glue. And so if I'm deviating from them a little bit, which by the way, they send really good instructions with it. And if I'm deviating, it's because I've done it this way and it seems to work out well. So you want to get this position. This doesn't matter, because this isn't like contact glue. You can set it on there and you can move it around. It's not a problem that way. And if there's a certain position you want to put it, now's the time to do it. Generally, I just look at it from the standpoint of, do I have equal overhang everywhere? And once you've got that in position, you can take the tip of the iron. I guess I can take the tip of the iron and just hold it on one little segment. And I always will work from one side to the other or from the middle out. You don't want to start and go over here and go over here, because you're not going to flatten things out as you go. And it's a real potential to put bubbles in the veneer that way. So that just tacks it in place. That keeps it from moving around. And then this is something like what's used to be called butcher paper. And it's just a kind of a protective, what do I want to say, layer that you put between the wood, the veneer, and the iron. It takes the potential of burning the veneer out of the equation. So you can see about how long I'm holding that there. It's staying a few seconds in any given position. You don't want to stop, but you don't want to rush through it. You definitely want to emulsify the glue so that the two glues kind of become one there. So too slow probably isn't a big issue. Too fast would be. If you don't get this stuck down really well, it'll show up later on when you don't want it to. So there I worked from the center this direction, and now I'm going to kind of go the opposite direction. And I'll take the iron. Not only am I overlapping quite a bit, probably at least 50% or more when I stroke back and forth like this, but I also roll a little bit of weight onto the edges. When I'm near the edge, I'll roll the iron, this is exaggerated, but in that direction a little bit, just to make sure that I'm getting a nice tight bond right on the edge. Okay, so I start every segment that way with okay. Maybe I should try something different. These are cooled off and ready to route. First thing I'm going to do is route around the perimeter, and then of course we've got a porthole and either the tube connectors or the area where your binding post cup is, and we'll do that later. I'll poke a drill from the inside, or I might just feel it with my fingers. You can usually push on it and find a bigger hole, but those other ones will be a little hard to do that way. So here we go with some noise. So you can see that flush trimmer does a really nice job there. You've got a little bit, the glue will sort of ball up as you go, and I don't know if you can see that. I'm actually scraping it with my fingernail. And I'll actually run the file I showed you earlier over that before I put the veneer on this side. And then as far as the ports go, oh, maybe I can't get that in there. Yeah, we're going to do that another way. So that's where a little pick, this could be done with a nail or almost anything. It helps to be kind of sharp on the end. That's not all that sharp, but it's sharper than the blunt of a nail. So I'm just pushing that into the hole where the tube connector is and pushing it through the veneer. Preferably in the middle of the hole, so if it happens to splinter a little bit, you won't get it at the edge. There's not a whole lot of coverage on tube connectors, so there's not a lot of flange. And I'm doing the same thing, I'm actually doing it by feel. Here, I'm just pushing that thing through. And then I can run a drill. Since that's a 1/4 inch trimming bit, a 1/4 inch drill will get us where we need to go there. Noise again. Alrighty, so that's routed off, and I'm going to do the other one. I'll speed through that, and then we'll get on to doing the sides, front, and opposite side. Forgot to add, this is an area where I'll use a file. You could use a sanding block here. Although you want to be careful of sanding block. If it's soft, you don't want to roll this edge. You want to keep that corner nice and crisp. So I found a file works really well. A mill file, like the single cut on this side, not so well, but the double cut side does work pretty well. And you want to stroke it so you're pulling into the cabinet, not pull it this way, because you could potentially splinter it there. So I don't know if it's obvious when from as far away as the camera is from me, but when I'm pulling that back, I don't have any pressure on it, but I do put pressure on the forward stroke. So I pull the veneer into the cabinet rather than pulling it this way, which would tend to want to pull it off. And I just feel out with my fingers, like I do a lot of things actually, feel it with my fingers, make sure it's what I want. And now we're ready to go on to the next step. Before we get started on veneering, I wanted to talk about one other thing, and this is kind of important. It can come back to haunt you later if you don't do this one step. So before you veneer the fronts, and you could do this, anytime. I'm just doing it now, kind of in sequence. But take an 1/8" drill bit and drill the pilot holes. This is assuming you're using the cabinets that I'm providing, and you want to drill these holes all the way through the cabinet, so they go on the inside. It won't affect anything later on, but what it's going to do is give you a way to locate those holes after the veneer is on, because it's going to cover them up, and it'd be a lot easier to do it this way than it would be to try and find them from the top side by putting the driver on there. You don't want to enlarge that hole a whole lot because it's just the right size for the pilot drill. So I don't know if that's evident to the camera. What I did was took that little scribe I had, and I'm poking it through that hole. And what I'll do when I go after I've got the veneer on is I'll poke that through the veneer. I don't want to push the veneer off. I don't want to run the risk of that, but kind of use it almost like a drill bit and just kind of roll it back and forth, push it through the veneer, then I can drill it from the front side. Once you've got two of them located, and if you put screws in those holes, then you could find the rest of them with the driver. But I would encourage you not to skip this step. You'll wish you hadn't. I can be certain of that because I've done it, and then it becomes a lot more difficult deal to make sure you're lining up with those holes. Okay, we are back in the saddle once again. The only way I could figure to do this video was kind of segments like that, so it seems kind of chopped up. It's just the best way to not make it incredibly long. So drill those holes out on the front. Don't forget that step, or you'll wish you had. I can almost guarantee it. Now this part, because we're going to be gluing 3 surfaces here, takes a little bit of forethought. The taping down of the veneer is pretty easy, but you got to figure out a way to put the glue on without setting it in the glue you just spread. And the way I'll do that is first get the lid off, and I'll spread one side, then flip it up and do the front, which is the side facing you right now. And obviously I'm doing the cabinet first because I've got it sitting on the veneer I'm going to put there. And I rinsed and blotted the roller, so That's why the bucket's nice. You don't have to worry about cleaning it. It'll sort of, I won't tell you it self-cleans, but it certainly makes things a little easier if that glue is partially dissolved. And I want just a smidgen more glue on that. It's not as even as I'd like to see it. And that's what I was talking about, kind of sneaking up on it as opposed to overdoing it and then wishing you hadn't. Although, unless it's really, really too much, it just makes the process longer because it'll take longer for it to dry. And theoretically, it would make a thicker glue line, but we're talking about tiny amounts of thickness, so I wouldn't worry about that a whole lot. You want to make sure and get that radius coated really well. Because that's the edge of the MDF, at least partially, it's going to want to absorb a lot of glue. So here's how I am going to work this side that I can't lay down on this side, obviously. I can do the front and one side. And here you want to be careful that you're not getting a whole bunch of glue into the driver openings. If you happen to see that you do it, wipe it out with your finger now, because if the surface in here on this rabbet is going to be where your trimming bit is going to run, and if it's got a big gob of glue in there, it will interfere with getting that trimmed out nice and round. And this doesn't take a lot of glue because it's not a whole lot of surface. I mean, we're going to cover over the holes and then route those out. So obviously the places that are getting glued are not that great when you compare it to the whole area. Make sure to go around the edges. And I'm going to put just a smidgen more on there because, again, I think I went a little light. Better that than the reverse, which is too much, I think. The roller does a really good job of evenly coating. If it really was kind of a revelation to me to start using this roller instead of a paint roller, because all it does is spread glue around. It really doesn't absorb anything. So look for any runs or drips or anything you've got over the side here. And then on the side, I've just set that up on a block. It could be anything. You want to be pretty clean though. You don't want a lot of sawdust or anything around when you're doing this because you don't want to trap any particles underneath the veneer. So I'll swing this around so you can kind of see what I've done. I mean, it might be obvious, but so all I've done is kind of squirted onto the surface there. And this glue is pretty sticky, so it stays on a vertical surface better than some wood glues. And then I can roll that right down to the edge. And because I'm going to glue in that surface that I'm rolling onto, I'm not concerned about having the roller touch it at this point. And again, want to make sure and get glue on that radius. That's probably the toughest thing to veneer here, is going around the radius and getting it nice and smooth so that it's not got big bumps or anything in it. And a lot of that is in the glue application, but even more of it is how it gets ironed on. And once this is dry, I'll show you how I do it. I start in the middle of the front of the cabinet and work my way around the radiuses, the radii. I think I keep saying radiuses. The radii, and then wrap down onto the side. Once you're onto this surface, it's pretty easy. So that looks good. We'll go on to the veneer, which I've got taped down. And that's another step you don't want to skip. Be sure and tape this down. You don't want to get glue on the surface of the veneer, especially if you're going to, and I'm assuming that if you're veneering that you're going to stain and clear finish in some way. But glue will really interfere with the way wood accepts stain. So do yourself a favor, tape it down, and that keeps the glue as you roll it around from getting on the other side of that. And there I'm picking out some little bit of something that was in there. And if you see that stuff, you want to get it as you go. You can pick it out once it's dry, but it's a little bit harder. But if you leave it there, it now becomes part of the cabinet when you put it on. So if you don't want a bumpy cabinet, don't do that. Alrighty, so we're going to let that dry, and we'll come back, we'll do that wrap. And then there's the top and the bottom, and that should cover it. And then later I'm going to do a video on finishing. I've got one specific one in mind, and I've got a sample of it made. And it's a kind of a neat way to use the grain in oak is really big and open, and there's some ways you can kind of accentuate that, even in a painted finish if you like that look. So it's just one of many ways you could do it. And we'll let that dry and come back a little later. So here we are at, I don't know, stage 7 or something like that. One thing I wanted to call to your attention that I failed to show in the prior segment was it'd be a good idea to run masking tape on these edges. I just didn't show it because as you're rolling the glue on the side, you don't want to roll around and get it on that face. So I ran masking tape on there, and obviously I've taken it off now. So that's something you should probably consider. Anytime you're rolling onto finish edges, and I'll try and remember to show that part when we do the top and the bottom, which will be the same deal. You want to run masking tape around the area where the veneer already is so you don't get glue on it. And if you're really careful, I guess you could avoid it, but kind of takes it to... adds an element of safety. How's that? So here we are. This has all been glued and it's dry now. And the way I'm going to assemble this is I'm going to start in the center and work my way out and down the sides. And the key is, again, not trying to chase a bubble somewhere. So you don't want to stick it here and then a little here and then a little over here. It's important that you follow some game plan of going from one side to the other or the middle out. And I'll show you more about what I mean when I actually do it. So in order to facilitate that, this side is about 2 inches longer than the total distance, might even be a little more than that, than the total distance up the side, across the face, and down the other side. So to make it work kind of easily, I'm just putting it up on a couple blocks of wood. And that way, this can drape over there and not hit the surface. Although it's really close, I'll tell you that I've got about a 1/4 inch I'm feeling on both sides there. So if I know I've got it centered this way and pretty well centered this way, there's leeway there, so you can be out of whack, let's try out of alignment a little bit and it won't be a problem. And like I said, we're just going to go right over the tops of the holes, and we'll cut those out when we trim the veneer. So making sure everything's good here. I've got overhang every place I need it. Once you stick it, you could actually undo it by heating it again, but it makes the process a lot harder than it needs to be. So just placing it where you want it now will make things a whole bunch easier. So there I'm just heating up one area, tacking that in place so it won't move around when I use the paper. And it's just like the other ones. I'm going to start at one side and go right across real slowly. In the other video, I stuck my hand where I've got it right now, and I've actually got my finger on the bottom side of the veneer, and I was curious about how long it took to actually heat that up, and that's about 4 or 5 seconds for that to get so hot that I can't touch it. And just beyond that point would be where that glue is going to melt. I don't know that exact temperature, but I can tell you that I was feeling it start to get sort of liquid as I pulled my finger away. So that's my really unscientific way of saying that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to work across the front. I'm not going to get into the radius on the side of the cabinet at this point because I want to get that front good and stuck. So I'm tipping my iron ever so slightly on that top edge. And the bottom edge there you can see. And then once that is good, and I would take the time to actually feel it at this stage of the game. Make sure that you don't have humps or anything that you'll have to take out later. And obviously they're going to have, where the driver holes are, that's going to feel a little lumpy because the veneer doesn't have anything to stick to. But in the areas between the drivers, you want to make sure that's all flat. And that feels good. So now, might be a good idea to double check. Yeah, we still got good overhang everywhere. And then I'm going to spin this around and sort of show how I do this. On the radius, the key is you want to work your way around, not stick it here and then work back this way, but work that right around the corner. The veneer will bend around that radius, but it needs to be massaged a little bit, maybe is a good way to put that. And you'll see me do it even without the paper at times. If you're working without paper or a towel, you want to be careful not to get it so hot that you burn the veneer. Because a burn would be a really hard thing to cover up later unless you use a really dark stain. So I'm back on, so I know this surface is good and secure at this point. And I'm just going to roll around back and forth. I'm just tipping a few degrees with each stroke on there. Going all the way back and forth on the edge of the cabinet. And this should get to a place where you followed that radius really precisely. And this is why it's important to make that radius. In the boat building world, they call that fair, meaning that it's not bumpy or lumpy or has square edges or anything weird that's not a perfect radius around it. And you can feel that. I feel a lot of things with my hands. I remember an old, or somewhere I read maybe, that feel things with or see things with your hands. And surprisingly, you can feel all sorts of imperfections when you actually just use your fingertips. They're real sensitive. And that feels good. That radius feels constant. There's no lumps or bumps. So now I can move on to the side, which I'm going to go ahead and put this like that. This is one of the beauties of that glue, is it won't grab on this side. Contact glue would. I'm not a big fan of contact glue for a veneer like this. It will surely give you fits. So now I'm just working that right at the edge. You can see I'm not using the paper. I just want to make sure I got a good smooth radius. It's a little hard to see through well, it's impossible to see through the paper. And now just work my way across that side. Pretty much the same thing over and over, slow and steady, pressure down so that it doesn't have to be a lot of pressure, and this iron, being old and heavy, actually does some of the work for me there. And when I get to the edges, tip just a little bit to make sure that sticks down. And again, I'm overlapping these strokes by Oh, probably 70% really as I look at it here. A lot of things you'll find, I guess I do by feel, and I'm trying to give that to quantify it some way so it doesn't just seem like a mystery. And then just a little tip on the edge. And that's just a degree or two. I'm not doing that. It's just to make sure that those edges, because the tendency for the veneer is to want to curl up, I just want to counteract that. And that's really all I'm doing. And there I'm feeling that, nice and flat, feels good on the radius. Looks tight on the edges. So we'll flip over and do that here. And that's the twist your arms up move. So I'm doing this radius. I actually probably could have done both of these while I had the speaker on its back. But I'm doing exactly the same thing as I did on the other one. And you can roll it like that. Good contact, good firm contact, rolling over it isn't going to be a problem, but you remember you're always trying to chase bubbles going away from, or to a logical end. I guess it's not always the same direction, but you need to know what direction you're going when you start. I think that's helpful. So that radius feels nice and smooth now. This process, by the way, is really forgiving. And one of the things I like about it, and one of the nice things if it's a new process to you, is it can be undone, but more importantly, it's not dependent on some sort of really fine details. It's just getting it hot enough for that glue to melt, and then given enough pressure for it to attach flat on whatever surface you're doing it on, assuming it's flat surface. I mean, obviously, we're not going on a flat surface around that radius, but that would be a really hard thing to do with raw veneer. So that's where the paper backed gives it enough flexibility and reinforcement where it can do things that would be hard any other way. All right. Feel that, feels nice and flat. So from here, it would be trimming the veneer with the router, let that cool off, trimming it with the router, and then the top and the bottom, which we'll do at the same time. I'll glue them kind of similarly to the way I did the sides. And so what I'm going to do now is set this aside, let it cool off, and I'm actually going to veneer the other one. And then we'll come back and show you trimming and then top and bottom. And that'll take us to the beginning of the finish stage where whatever finish you've chosen, you could start at that point. So see you in a few. Back in the saddle for some trimming, and I'm going to be doing something with this router that I just want to let everybody know I'm real comfortable with, but not everybody would be, and that is I'm going to follow this radius with the router. Roll it right around like that. If that feels uncomfortable to you and you're not accustomed to using a router, I'd say use some other method. You can use that's a utility knife blade, or you could use a razor blade, and you could just come up close to it and then take this and sort of stroke right at the edge until you come through the other side. It can be done, it's kind of slow, but better to be kind of easy with it than trying to do it all in one fell swoop. What you don't want to do is have it splinter out on this side, because there's nothing you can do to really repair that at that time. And so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. You'll see me going through the whole process and maybe talk a little bit in between, but here we go. So get some of the scraps out of the way at that point, and I'll flip it over. Do this side, and then we'll do the front with the cutouts for the drivers. And that's it. And then we go on to the top and bottom. And once again, you saw me do something that I have handled routers a lot, and I don't mean to sound like I'm bragging, but I have handled them a lot, and so some operations like that might feel uncomfortable to a lot of people. I would say if it feels uncomfortable to you, don't do it. Don't push your luck. And the other thing you saw me do is after I came around there, I slid my router to the side. And I'm actually carrying that router 95% of the weight of it in my hand. So it's not even really riding on the surface all that much. I'm just using it as a guide. And it's just to get that scrap out of the way so it doesn't get tangled up in the blade. It's not a big deal. I mean, you saw me do it with scissors, and you saw me do it both with the router. So now on the face side, we got to give an access hole for the router, and we know I can feel, and you'll be able to feel it too, that's the woofer side of things. You could look at the other side of the cabinet and tell that too, because the binding post or the place for the tube connectors is going to be at the bottom, the port at the top. And I'm going to go ahead and route this hole out first with that, and then we'll use the other trim bit for doing the recessed area of the router. All I'm doing right now is just giving a place for the router to start. And by the way, you could use a plunge router. I have plunge routers. Again, I'm handling routers in ways that might not seem very orthodox, but I do feel comfortable doing it, and I don't think I've ever experienced a problem that led me to think twice about doing it. But let your own comfort be your guide there. Of course, that cut out around the deeper or the smaller diameter hole that goes through there, but we still have that rabbet to cut. And that's where this trimmer comes into play. Because it's got such a shallow bearing surface, it can actually go right into that rabbet and trim that. And what you want to do is lower your bit until it's just above the lower surface of that rabbet. And I actually set this router up before I veneered the cabinet. So the veneer height is actually bringing it up, and I set it right down on the horizontal surface of that rabbet there. And the thickness of the veneer raises it just a smidgen. That's about 25 thousandths. Just enough to keep from skating around in there. It's going to be covered, so it's not a huge deal, but since we're setting it up, we might as well set up in a way that doesn't cause damage. And we'll do that now. Waiting for that to quit making noise. So one of the things you saw me do right there was you want to keep that router bit always moving. Don't want to have it dwell in any one spot, because that bearing, because it's not an actual bearing, because it's a bushing, if you let it sit, it's going to burn, probably. That's usually the first thing that happens. So what happened right then was that little piece that I trimmed out, it was getting kind of hung up. So I pulled out and started talking, and now I'm just going to take one final pass quickly around there. And the little hairs you see here will sand off when you break that edge with sandpaper and or sanding sponge. Segment number 14, or even more. I don't remember. I haven't been keeping track. Now we're on to gluing tops and bottoms, and good idea here, and I'll go ahead and show this since I missed it when I did the backs, is to mask these surfaces off because you don't want to get glue on them. It really will throw a curveball. So an easy way to do that is just to take the masking tape and run it around kind of wild, maybe leave a 1/4 inch hanging off. Just go around the hole. And well, don't do that. Although it's not a big roadblock. And we'll go back, start over. Kind of line that up. And then make sure that's pressed down. And then just take a sharp single edge razor blade. And once you get it started, you can just skate around there and cut that tape off right flush with the surface, which is what you want. That way, if you happen to run the roller over the edge, hope you could see that, and even though my hand was kind of in the way. That way, you could just mask it conventionally. You don't have to cut the tape. I guess I could show that as well. Let me grab another roll of thinner tape. So whatever you feel most comfortable doing. And just flush with the top. If it was a smidgen over the top, it wouldn't be a huge deal. But you wouldn't want it hanging over or anything more than, say, a 30-second or something, because you'll end up trying to actually glue the masking tape to the surface, and that'll just make things more complicated later. Okay. Get that stuck down. I'm just going to do the one now for the sake of saving a little time here, but just know I'm going to do the same thing on the other one. And I'm going to then roll all these out just like the other stuff. And once it's dry, then we'll go application, route it off, do the same thing on the other side. Oh, one thing I will show you. When I put the glue on, I'm going to do one end and then do like we did with the other side. I'll flip that down on its back and I'll apply glue on the other end. Maybe I should show that and then I'll speed it up or I'll cut it out. I don't know. I just have to make this something that's not so lengthy that people get tired of watching, because there's kind of a lot of information here and I want to make sure I get you as much as I can. So if you do this, you can be successful at it. So let's just do that. My roller has been in a bucket all that time, and I'll just use a rag and blot it a little bit. And I'll sometimes stick it in the bucket and just shake it back and forth just to get the glue off of it. You really don't want to have glue residue. If it's a little moist, it's no big deal. You don't want water running out of it, certainly while you're doing this part. And really, even though I'm going to do both of these ends, actually the top and bottom, simultaneously, you wouldn't have to. You could do them one at a time. It doesn't really make any difference. I guess I'm trying to show as much as I can in as little time as I can. The big key always with this glue is to get an even spread right out to the edges. Any voids won't get stuck, and that's not a good way. Veneer wants to be stuck as close to 100% of the surface area as is possible. And so So there's one. I'm putting that up on a block, spreading glue like we did before. Let me turn that around so you can see it. And when I set it aside to dry, I'll also set it on a block so I don't glue it to a tabletop or something like that. Now you can kind of see why you want to mask those areas, because it'd be real easy to just roll right over that edge and get glue on that veneer. And glue on veneer is kind of a funny thing. You think you've got it off, you think you sanded it off, until you hit it with stain, and then you find out there's a patch there that won't take stain in the same way. Not very fun at that point. And you can't do a whole ton of sanding on veneer. It's only a few mils thick. So, you know, sanding 1/8 of an inch off, well, you're gonna get past the veneer, past the paper, past everything. And then it's do-over time. Nobody likes do-over time, right? All right, so there's a cabinet. I'll set that aside. I'm gonna glue the other one. I'm gonna put glue on all these, and then we'll pop back in and stick them, iron them on, I guess, and trim it off, and that's it for this segment. We're finally rolling down to the end here. So I've got the top and bottoms glued. I'm setting this on paper so I don't get any dust in it, because that's glue, but it's dry. And all the tops and bottoms veneer are dry. So ready to iron these on, tops and bottoms. And so I'm going to do one, and then the other, and then I'll trim them. I'll probably speed through that just to keep this short. I'm hoping that I end up with a lot shorter video. My target is under 30 minutes, and I'm hoping I can reach that. So bear with me. There's goodness here worth watching, but I'm just trying to condense it in a really digestible way. So, all right, so off we go here. I'll quit talking so I can do what I say I'm going to do. So I ran the grain this direction. I think it looks a little better, but you could run it the opposite direction, just depending on how you cut it in the first place. And looking at equal overhang on both sides. Sometimes I'll take the time to align grain a little bit there, which I think I might do here. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to finish these. I've got another set of red oak ones that I'm going to finish in the distress finish I told you about. So I got that where I want it. White oak has gray streaks in it, sometimes brownish streaks, and what I'm doing is I'm sort of aligning it with the sides. Now, in all fairness, this is the bottom, so I don't know who would ever see it, but I do the same on the top. So tack it down. Paper. Work from the middle out. And that's just my way of doing things. You could conceivably work from one side to the other. There are no rules. Well, there are some rules, I guess. There's some guidelines you want to follow. Work one direction, either from the middle out or from one side to the other, but don't start on one side and then jump over to the other side. And moving around like that will usually give you fits in almost any kind of application like this. I've put in my lifetime probably miles of Formica, what is a lot of people know as Formica anyway, which is a laminate for countertops. Not so popular anymore, but you definitely work from one side to the other with that stuff, because if you get a bubble in it, it's a really hard thing. This, at least you can unwind a little bit if you had to. Hopefully you don't have to. Again, tipping around the edges. Want to make sure I get really tight down there. And once more over here. You can't smell this, but white oak has a really distinctive smell when you heat it up like this. Walnuts, kind of the same way, and it's the same way when you're cutting it. Walnut has a real distinctive, all woods have, I guess, a smell, but some are stronger than others. Make sure and give that a feel with your hand. Make sure there's no goobers on there that are going to screw you up. Now this is the top, so looks-wise, this is hair splitting, which I'm famous for. And all I'm doing is eyeballing that and seeing how I think I'd like that grain to align. And I like it better this way. So that's the way it's going to be. And it'll be your choice to do that too. And all that matters if you're just going to put a stain and clear finish on it. If you're going to do a black finish or black ash, as it's often called, which is just, you see the grain, but you don't see any of the color of the grain. It's all black. It's essentially black paint that lets the grain show through. If you're doing that, it doesn't really matter what the green looks like, because all you see is the texture of it, not the color. That feels nice and flat. So I'm going to set this one aside, do the other one, and I'll fast forward through it, and then we'll come back and trim these, and we'll be done. Yippee! Alrighty, so that's done, and I am going to get some stuff set up here a little bit, and the last segment will be about trimming these, which is something you've already seen, but I'll just go ahead and do it so you'll see the end result, and that'll be all to the epic veneer installation video. All right, off we go to trimming, and I wanted to show one thing here. I actually did something that I have cautioned you against, and I got too close to my edge, and what happened, I don't know if I can get the camera to see that, but I got right on the edge of where I had that taped off. So fortunately, both surfaces were glued. I've checked it. It's nice and tight. But that's something you want to avoid. You want to stay within the area that you have glue on. And I was right on the edge. There was about a 1/16 of an inch that maybe didn't get glue on one surface, but there was enough glue on this surface to make up for it. So something to watch out for. And now noise and trimming. And I've got that router bit set. Total depth, probably about 5/8 of an inch. So it's hanging down about a 1/4 inch below the bottom of that. I should say the cutting surface is hanging down about a 1/4 inch. And that way you take off glue, hopefully, and anyway, we'll continue here. you'll see me going back over that same surface. I go one way and then I come back the other. And what I'm doing when I am doing that is just putting ever so slight pressure against the bearing. So I want to make sure and get that trimmed off as much as I can, because anything that I don't get trimmed off with a router, I got to do with a file or a sander. And there you have it. Lots of sawdust everywhere. Actually, this isn't too bad. One thing I would always encourage, though, is if you're doing this kind of like I am, where you're working in the same space that you're gluing and routing, you want to be sure and keep that workspace clean when you're applying the glue, because you don't want to get those things in there. So there they are, ready to finish sand. And I'll use a file around these edges like I showed you when I was doing the other ones. And you have to be a little more careful because obviously you're working on a finished surface there. But I'm going to save that for another video. So that's it for now. If you've hung in there with me this long, thanks for watching. I really do appreciate you taking the time out of your day to look at me doing the things I like to do. And hopefully you like to do them too. So we'll see you next go. That'll probably be a finishing video. And I think I'm going to actually finish the red oak ones. These are white oak. And thanks again. And you know, they always say at the end of videos, subscribe. Well, I don't know. People don't know that. I don't have to tell you that, right? If you like what I'm doing, you'll subscribe. Seems that simple to me. And anyway, see you later, folks.